welcome to our latest episode of Security Noise. What the DIT? Today we have Alex Ball with us to discuss a tool that he's been working on to further explore those NTDIT databases, and of course Skyler Tudor, our producer, to make sure that the show sounds great. I do have one quick This Week in InfoSec announcement. One of the things that we've been seeing lately, and you can read more about it on Bleeping Computer if you want, is code generation via LLMs is actually hallucinating like entire dependencies. And what attackers have noticed, or having noticed that, they've kind of responded to this by they're generating basically malicious dependencies and putting them in PyPy and putting them in Gem and NuGet and places like that. So I guess we're back to kind of the old saw, which is really understand what you're including in your project when you do that, because it's a new and exciting way to get owned with some very convincing malware dressed up to look like a useful library. Of course, I also do want to mention our Discord server. You can go to discord.gg/trustedsec if you want to join. Well, Alex, I'll just jump right over to you then today, since we're going to do a show about a tool, which we haven't done in a while. But this is some interesting stuff, and I do have a lot of questions, especially when we get into how you built the tool and what you did to understand the ESEDB internals and things like that. Tell us a little bit about DIT Explorer and what it is and why a pen tester might need it.
Sure. So DIT Explorer is a tool that you can use to explore DIT files, hence the name. The general idea is you can take an offline DIT file that you take from a DC, or maybe you recover it from a VHDX or some other offline storage of some sort, and you need to open it. That isn't really easy to do otherwise. So you're looking at either standing up a domain controller or maybe configuring some other configuration of Active Directory or something to open it. But this is just a standalone tool where you give it a DIT file and open it, and it presents the directory as a tree of objects. So it's similar to ADSI-Edit, where you see all the different folders and containers, and then you see the objects in those containers, and you can see the attributes. So I can see this being used in a few different scenarios. So one, obviously, is if you want password hashes, because everyone wants password hashes. But also, if you just want to explore the, let's say, the topology of the enterprise, you can go into DIT Explorer and look at the different sites and services, look at how their OUs are laid out, and learn a little bit more about the enterprise that way. Okay. And how does this compare with other tools? I'm thinking the old ESEDB tools, from when I was doing internal pen tests a while back. And of course, there's some other things that are a little bit newer, like Bloodhound and stuff like that, although that's maybe more of an online tool. So I suppose one thing that sets DIT Explorer apart is it was really meant for basic research. That's really how it started out, where I knew that there was a wealth of information stored in NTDS.dit. You have specialized tools for dumping hashes. That's the main thing, is everyone wants hashes. So you run this tool, it goes through this database, finds hashes. Some tools will dump it to like a CSV file, so you can see all the fields and all the tables and everything. But that isn't really useful from a research perspective. So the purpose of DIT Explorer was to take that information and present it in a way that's useful to you. And so hence you have the hierarchical display. And so I use the terms physical representation and logical representation. So if you look at this ESE file, in a physical sense, the information is arranged in tables and columns and fields like any database. ESE databases are a little special in that your fields can contain multiple values. So you don't normally see that in most database engines. Which also presents a problem when you export to CSV. So how do you delineate the fact that this field actually contains multiple values? So that's the physical representation. And so then what I refer to as the logical representation is how does the directory system agent interpret this? So when you make an LDAP query to a domain controller, how does that request correlate to physically retrieving those rows and columns from the database? And so DIT Explorer presents the logical view of the database rather than the physical view. And so it makes sense of these various columns. It resolves the named columns for you. So in my article, I talk about how the columns are named based on an attribute number, and that's pretty much it. So you have ATT, a character of some sort, and then a number that doesn't really mean anything to a human reading this. So DIT Explorer resolves that and says, hey, I know what this column is, I know how to interpret the value, and I know how to present that to the user in a meaningful way. So then on top of that, I said, okay, so this is a great basic research tool. So it's great to explore how Active Directory works and how it's structured, but now let's get to some more practical scenarios. So I started adding things like the hash dump feature to it, to where you can go to a user object or an object. I think specifically I check to see if the object has an SID and something else, and that's what defines a user object. And so if it has hashes and has that RID, then you get the option to extract credentials from that object. There's a few other convenient features I added, like the ability to search, and I really aim to reproduce the same experience you'd get with ADS or even something like DIT Explorer, but from the diff file. And I haven't seen that in any other tool. So most other tools are designed to do one thing well, like extract hashes, but aren't meant as a general means to view the diff file.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting because certainly, you want to be able to spend some time and look at ADSI edit and see, how the schema has been extended and things like that in your tests, so you get an idea of what other services and stuff are running in that domain. Very, useful thing to be able to do offline, at least if you're trying to stay quiet. So I can see, I would have loved to have this a long time ago. I am curious, especially with some of the multi-valued fields and the general lack of documentation around NTDS.dit content and things like that. How did you figure out what some of these values were, or what was that process like?
Time and patience. So a few different sources. So one of them was going through NTDSAI.dll. And so that seemed to be the DLL that actually interfaces with the ESC database. So you also have NTDSA.dll, which that's the one loaded by the OS for Active Directory, and then it loads NTDSAI.dll. And so in that DLL, I saw a lot of calls to the jet ESC functions. So I also searched for those column names. So I ran into this scenario where I knew it was an ESC database. So it was simple enough to write a tool to enumerate the tables. So you had something as generic as a table called data table. So okay, that must be where the data is, but how is it structured? So I wrote a program to then dump out the individual columns, to dump out the schema, to dump out the indexes. And then I ran into that most of the columns have ATT blank or character number. So those must be the attributes, so just inferring that. So that was just a guess. And then, so I took one of the numbers on a whim and searched my document for that number, thinking that must be some sort of ID. Logically, it just has to be some sort of ID. And I found the column containing that number that just so happened to contain all the other numbers. So I thought, okay, here, this column is significant. I don't know what it is, but it's significant because it's sort of like the map of all the other columns. So then that column has an ID, and I'm thinking, well, now we have a problem, because how was I supposed to get this master column name to resolve all the other columns? And so then I looked at the different strings in NTDS and noticed that some of those column names are hard-coded, and one of the hard-coded columns was the column I was looking at. So I thought, okay, well, so to bootstrap this database, here are the column names you have to know that are just hard-coded. So I extracted those from NTDSAI.dll. Now, I didn't know this at the time. I figured those were maybe some sort of randomly generated or maybe an auto-incremented column or something came up with these numbers. I didn't really know what they were, just that they were some sort of ID. So that was enough to get me to the point that I could map out all the columns. Now, some of them I had to kind of guess. So basically, I would guess and then form a hypothesis, and if it was right, then maybe my guess was right, and if not, figure something else out. There were some articles I referenced in my blog post that did also give pointers. So again, if you're reading something on something that's undocumented, how do you know that they're right? So maybe I would read those articles and use that as a pointer, but it's something I wanted to verify myself. So that was the main breakthrough, is when I figured out what that master column was. So then as far as the type codes, so you had I call it a type code. So you have ATT, character, number. So the number is obviously some sort of ID. But what does this letter mean? And so my steps for that were, let's take all the fields in all the columns for all the attributes and see what sort of correlation we see between that type character and anything else in that record. And it was one of the syntax, I think it was attribute syntax ID was the actual attribute, but there seemed to be a one-to-one mapping on whatever that column said to what the letter was. So that was just an inference. I did look into NTDSAI.dll, but the code for figuring out that character looked somewhat complex. I figured it was, at this point, the data supported my guess, so I just went with it.
I was curious if you ran into any surprises, like things were different between domain function levels or anything like that.
Yeah, so probably one of the bigger surprises had to do with the data types. So you see a data type like long binary, and you're thinking, okay, it's some sort of byte encoded data. One of those was the security descriptor. So in Windows, you have a well-known format for the security descriptor, and that's all document everything. But none of these matched that. So my first attempt was just try to parse those using that function. It didn't work. I then noticed that all the descriptors were oddly 8 bytes long, every single one of them, and so that was a little weird. Then I figured out that it's just a number, it's just an 8-byte integer, and my only guess is there's historical reasons, like maybe they used to store the actual security descriptor there, but they seem to have moved to a system of that stored in, I want to say SD prop or something like that, and that was in my blog, but that's now an index into that column or into that table instead of storing the actual descriptor. I did see some references to what I think is the address book. So I think it was like AB_CNT or something. I didn't really find anything significant there, but maybe that'll matter some days. That's another area of exploration. There was something interesting. It was on the tip of my tongue and I just forgot it. Maybe it'll come back to me. I guess there are a few other interesting things, like there was an ancestors column where it's a binary column where all of the IDs are appended. And so I'd kind of ask myself, what operations does Active Directory do where this column might be useful? And so on that one, I actually implemented a function in DIT Explorer for searching an entire subtree, which you can do through an LDAP query. And so my guess is they implemented that as a binary column for sorting and indexing purposes. So it's easy to select a subtree. And I guess it did provide some insight into how Active Directory actually works internally. So when you issue an LDAP query with search subtree or search expand members, like what features of the ESC database does that DLL use to make that happen?
Yeah, I did see in your blog you identified some rules, like you can't have duplicate SAM accounts, but you can have duplicate SIDs and things like that. Obviously, most of the time from an attacker's perspective, we're absconding with the database, but I'm curious if you've done any experiments with putting it back where you violate some of those constraints intentionally after maybe modifying it to see if you could hide a user in AD that the admin can't see or anything like that.
Yeah, so spoilers, the answer is yes. Now, one area that interests me particularly is that every attribute column can contain multiple values. Now, in Active Directory, you can say that an attribute is single valued, so logically that column wouldn't accept multiple values, but what if it does? So at that point, we're looking at modifying the NTDS.dit file manually and then putting it back on the DC. So far, those have all resulted in blue screens. Not sure why, but that's an ongoing research effort I'm doing, especially because what if you do add multiple values for one of those index columns that it uses for lookup, especially for like a security sensitive function? Will it know that that's an extra column value? Like, does it verify that after lookup? And let's say you do discover a problem. How do you fix it? I don't know of any tool that's exposed to the administrator to actually fix that, other than maybe export the DIT file, fix it, and then do a directory services restore or something to put it back. So that is actually an ongoing area of research right now.
Very interesting. Are you building any tooling to maybe do this in an automated way, or are we just hand editing the file with the old hex editor at this point?
No, so not hand editing. So I have a program that goes through and makes the legitimate JET ESE calls. I'm running into some problems with both versioning and callbacks. So there are times when I run the program that, so if I move it from a DC, so my setup right now is I have a Windows 11 box that I do all my development on. And then I have a Windows 2022 DC and a Windows 2025 DC, and I'm playing with both of those. But the versions of ESE or eSent specifically are different on those. So if I edit on the Windows 11 and push it back to the 2022 box, it says invalid version and you're done, can't continue. Some operations will try to load NTDS.dit, which I find interesting, and I haven't searched the database yet to figure out how exactly it's referencing those DLLs, but if you run, I think it's eSentUtil on the command line, you'll see an error message that it can't find NTDSA or NTDSAI.dll. So I am running into problems with doing the modification. Now, you can go a different route. So there is the hex editing route, where that gets real hairy because you're talking about editing B trees and other madness. And I'm sure there is some sort of a checksum on the pages in the database file that'll become invalid if you do that. But another option is to use like a homegrown ESE implementation. So that's what Impacket did, at least for reading. I don't know that Impacket can write. I've never looked into that. But the ESE engine, I want to say current as of 2 or 3 years ago, ESE is open source. So you can go out on GitHub and look at it. And it isn't documented at all, really, but you can infer the structure of the database. And so I could write my own tool to read and write the ESE files and then get around those problems I just mentioned. And the question, I mean, it's always a problem of time and priority at that point. So I haven't gone to the effort to do that yet. But that is one of the.
Yeah, I can imagine digging into that disk format versus using the native libraries to do it would be quite a significant additional lift.
Yeah.
So I can totally see going that way. From a tester's perspective and in terms of people using it, so you do need to run this on Windows, or does it work fairly well in wine environments and things like that?
So the only, I'll say Windows specific, okay, there's 2 Windows specific dependencies. So there's the GUI application is based on WPF, which does require Windows, but it works just fine on wine. And then you have ecent.dll, which works on Windows, and I have not tested that on wine, so I honestly can't answer that question. But I did implement it in such a way that the projects have been in layers. You have the we'll call it the ecent interop layer, and so there's a NuGet package called manage ecent, which is a very, very thin wrapper around the ecent unmanaged DLL, and it's very thin in that it doesn't really represent it doesn't really have an object model as much as it just exposes the individual jet API functions. So I built an object model around that can really be used for any ecent database. There's nothing specific to NTDS.dit, so that's the sort of the base layer. So then you have the idea of a directory and directory objects. And that's, again, not specific to the NTDS.dit file, but it could be used, for example, just a normal LDAP connection to a directory or some other source. And so it abstracts the idea of objects and containers and attributes and schema and all that. Then I have a library that joins those two together. And so you have NTDS directory that implements this directory interface and these directory objects, but it implements it using my ecent interop layer. So you now have the NTDS directory that can load the NTDS.dit file. Now, all of those can be used without the GUI front end. And if I were to write my own C#-based ecent implementation, I would plug it in that layer, over here, and that would work fine just cross-platform. One of my ideas for DIT Explorer, or really for that project, not the GUI specifically, was other ways to access the data. So think of another front end like running in PowerShell. And that'd be similar to, I want to say, DS internals, where you would open the directory, you would call that backend library, you could enumerate containers, enumerate objects and attributes and whatnot, and do that all from the command line. And then you have the idea of, well, now we can we can automate administrative tasks, or maybe some sort of compliance check on the DIT file regularly. And all of that would work without the GUI. So as of yet, I think it would all work fine on Wine, but I have not tested it.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of all those, pen test situations where they give you a jump box or something and it's Kali or something like that, and having the tool be portable would be nice. But I mean, it sounds like maybe if you're in x86 land, you might even be able to bring that native DLL along for the ride. If you needed to from your Windows system, if you could at least import that into the environment and get off to the races that way. What's the next phase of the project for you then?
So I have it broken down to a few what I call arcs, and so these are kind of my main overall goals. Some of them architectural, and some of them are based on user experience. And so really the first one, and this aligns with my basic research goal, present the information in a meaningful way. So we have the containers and objects and attributes, but what do those attributes mean? What do they actually represent? And so a lot of times in Active Directory, you'll have a field that's encoded as a number, but the number itself doesn't really mean anything. Like it's not interpreted as a number, it's interpreted maybe as a bit field or as enumerated constants or whatever. So the first phase is making sure all the attributes are presented in a meaningful way. And that does create a bit of a conflict because, as I mentioned, it's a basic research tool. So what if you actually want it to be presented in the raw presentation? You want to see the raw integer because you want to write your own tool or something. So that presents a little bit of a user experience challenge or UI challenge for how do I convey this information to the user in a meaningful way that's also not obnoxious or whatever. So the first phase really is present all the information in a meaningful way. Now, one of the guys that was on we did the Discord live stream, and one of the suggestions that came of that was to draw icons, because everybody likes icons. Right now it's just kind of a boring text-based interface. And I thought, yeah, that would be good, but let's go a step further and add a little more meaning to it. And so we get into this idea of not just presenting information in a meaningful way, but like we can derive information and see things at a glance. And so one of the ideas was for a user icon. Let's show a user icon, which is traditionally like a person's head or head and shoulders or whatever, but have the icon change for different statuses. So if this account's locked out, maybe it'll have a key or a padlock next to it. Or if the user account's disabled, maybe it'll be ghosted. Or you could have both. A ghosted account with a key icon means it's locked out and disabled. Then that kind of got me thinking on that's a sort of a formula-based thing, and really the idea of account lockout. And by the way, we're transitioning into the next phase here. So a lot of the attributes in Active Directory are computed in that they are not stored in the DIT file at all anywhere. You won't find them. And one of those is the attribute that controls account lockout. So you have let's say bad password count, does this account actually use a password for login, and a few other things that go into the formula of is this account locked out. So most of those are published. So that's in I think it's MS-EDTS, the Active Directory Technical Specification. So the next phase is introduce this concept of computed fields. So you can now retrieve those same fields that you would retrieve through LDAP. But we could go one better and say, let's allow user-defined computed fields. So maybe there's something you care about that isn't in Active Directory, like you want to know passwords that are fresh or something arbitrary. So I want to see all accounts with passwords that are less than 7 days, or stale passwords that are greater than 7 days since they've been changed or something like that. So the idea is you can now create your own custom fields and enter your own formulas. So like a C# or C++ looking expression that the system evaluates. And then if you want to apply overlays or custom icons based on that formula, or maybe you can have custom formatting, like you want this row to be red or this attribute to be red based on this formula, you can do that as well. So just coming up with a bunch of ways to make this useful. So then what's kind of the end goal of that? All right, so I've kind of mentioned that DIT Explorer was designed as a basic research tool, but I can see this being used for a variety of practical scenarios. So one of those being compliance testing. And so the thought with that is, say, once a month you analyze your directory for, let's say, like password history. You want to know if there's been anything funny going on, like maybe an administrator has reset a user's password several times, or maybe a user has changed their password several times or not changed their password, or just anything you can think of where we run a series of checks that you can't necessarily do through the LDAP interface on Active Directory. And so that can be used both on say blue team side, so maybe as a compliance function, or it can also be used as pen testers to scan a directory file as part of an engagement. So that's one idea I had. Now, more on the red team side, another idea I had was to integrate this with another project that I've been working on that will be coming out sometime soon, but the short version is it's a protocol library also implemented in C# of all the common Windows protocols. So think SMB, LDAP, RPC, Kerberos, NTLM, whatever. So I'd like to integrate that with DIT Explorer so that we can take a DIT file and stand up an actual KDC. So now you pull back a DIT file, stand up a KDC with that DIT file, and now you can run your tools to request tickets of whatever account. Maybe you can write some sort of a filter that says, hey, when I request this ticket, you actually want to add all these other groups to the ticket and then sign it with the key that you have because you have the entire DIT file. So that's something I'm really excited about. Also, maybe act as an LDAP server so that you can run some basic LDAP queries against the DIT file. Again, because it might be a little difficult to to stand up an actual domain controller with the DIT file. So this would just be a lighter way of doing that.
Do you already know like how you would achieve something like that? Like how you would spoof that?
All the not all the information. So most of the information is going to be in the DIT file. So all your account level information will be in the DIT file. And of course, the BTGT hash will be there. The one thing you need external is the system hive, because you need that to decrypt the hashes. That's pretty standard, but you have those two pieces. I already have the implementation of Kerberos ready to go, so it can act as a key distribution center and receive those TGS or AS requests and respond appropriately.
Very cool.
And then I had a few other ideas that are more spin-offs, and so now we're venturing outside the realm of DIT Explorer proper, but it would use a lot of the same code base. So as part of the hash dump extension I added, you have to extract the boot key or system key from the system registry hive, and then use that to decrypt the hashes that are stored in the DIT file. But to do that, I had to read those registry files in an offline way, so it doesn't use the Windows API at all. So now I have essentially this full implementation. So in implementing the hash dump feature, I had to implement a library that reads Windows registry files offline, so it can extract the syskey to decrypt those. So one spin-off project would just be an offline registry browser. So maybe you want to go in there and look at secrets or service configuration or whatever. So not really even related to Active Directory, but the code would already be there, so why not share it? Two other features would be integration. So one is the side of getting information into NTDS.dit or into DIT Explorer. One way would be through LDAP or maybe ingest XML files or whatever. The other would be pushing data. So think of popular solutions that would analyze the data from Active Directory, so we could export it as JSON, XML, whatever, or maybe have standard interfaces to products like Bloodhound. So you could take this offline DIT file and do your own custom analysis using whatever software package. So those are really some of the main things I want to do with it.
Very interesting. I do apologize to everyone. My video has gone away because my router keeps overheating. So that is where we are now with that. I am curious to see where Alex is going to continue going with this, and I look forward to new pieces of it being released and additional tools as they come out. I think we will probably wrap it up today since we're pushing our luck with the technology, but I very much appreciate Alex for taking the time to join us, and I appreciate all of you for listening to Security Noise. This is a production of TrustedSec LLC. If you or your organization have any questions or need information security assistance, go to www.trustedsec.com. We'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
See you.